Welcome to Two Session Spotlight. I'm Xiaomeng in Beijing. Joining us today is Professor Xie Tao, Dean of School of International Relations and Diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Welcome to the studio, Professor Xie.
My pleasure.
During the ongoing two sessions, we've noticed that Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Sunday responded to a number of questions regarding China's diplomatic affairs during a press conference. So which question that he responded to most impressed you?
Well, let me see. If I remember correctly, he answered a total of 27 questions. That's the largest number ever answered by Mr. Wang Yi. So of these questions, I think two struck me very much. One is when a journalist asked him about the situation in Xinjiang, he had a very powerful rebuttal. He said, when people mention the word genocide, people often think about Americans' killing of native Indians, of Americans' killing and enslavement of African Americans. And the people think of a Holocaust during the Second World War. And so why would you use this word and apply it to the situation in Xinjiang? So I think this is a very powerful rebuttal. This is one question. I think it's the last question, or one of the last question. Somebody asked him about so many foreign journalists are in Beijing covering the two sessions, and what would he say to the foreign journalists? And he said, we welcome foreign journalists to report on China. And somebody mentioned about Edgar Snow, his book, Red Star Over China, right? That's a classic. And so Mr. Wang Yi said, we obviously hope that there will be a new generation of Edgar Snow to report on China. And so that reminds me that, China has many good stories. And so it depends on how you tell the stories about China to a foreign audience. Of course, we do hope that a foreign journalist would tell the good stories about China, but we also have many, many excellent international renowned journalists here in China, Chinese journalists. And so I do hope people like you guys can also tell good stories about China to the rest of the world. Okay.
And we know that this year is also a little bit special because we are still living in a world of COVID-19. The pandemic is still ravaging the world, and we're living in a world in which major changes are unfolding, which we call a centennial transitional period. Professor Xie, in what way do you think that the pandemic has changed the world?
The New York Times columnist Tom Friedman wrote a book many years ago called The World is Flat. It's a book in celebration of globalization. I think, in light of COVID-19, I would say the world is not just flat, but it's also fragile. You look at the world has been pretty much devastated by COVID-19, right? Yet, unfortunately, even though we have, increasing economic, cultural, technological interdependence, but the people are not so intimately interconnected with each other. So one example is that during the COVID-19 crisis, you would expect there is much more global coordination, global cooperation in the fight against the COVID-19. But you did not see this. So on the one hand, we do have globalization. On the other hand, this COVID-19 highlights the problems that we are facing. Even though we are becoming more interconnected, but we still need more cooperation. And so I think that's a very big lesson taught to us by COVID-19. In the post-COVID-19 world, we need to think about how to enhance international cooperation, not just about economic cooperation, cultural cooperation.
And talking about China, what do you think the pandemic has changed China's international relations and diplomacy?
Well, I think it's fair to say that China stands out probably alone in the world in its astonishing success in controlling the pandemic within a very short period of time. China has the world's largest population, over 1.4 billion people. And so the Chinese government's initial response was very decisive. They decided to lock down the whole city of Wuhan, which has more than 10 million people, right? And so that effectively prevented the virus from spreading and infecting many other people, not just in China, but also in other countries. And then after that, of course, the situation here became much better. And so there was relaxed control. And then we have a a sporadic outbreak of cases, but the government was very effective in bringing the pandemic under control. Whereas you look at in the West, look at the United States. United States supposedly has the world's most advanced medical technology. But look at the situation there. I think in the United States, it's probably performance in terms of the pandemic control would be ranked at the very bottom around the world. Look at the Western European countries, they are also still struggling. You look at Africa, you look at some Latin American countries, they are still trapped in this whole situation. So I would say China has done a far better job in pandemic control, and so has kind of set a very good example for other countries to follow.
You talked about the United States' bad performance in disease prevention and control, and it's been over 2 months since Joe Biden took office, and we've been hoping that the relations between China and the United States would turn around, and China has been sending positive signals to the U.S. in the hope of normalizing China-U.S. relations. But some analysts say that it seems like the U.S. attitude towards China hasn't changed much. So what's your attitudes towards the prospects of China-U.S. relations?
Yes, you're right. I remember starting with our Chinese ambassador to the United States, Mr. Cui Tiankai, and he was the first to send out a positive message to the incoming Biden administration. And then there was this talk by the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Le Yuchen, and he laid out the 4 R's: respect, restart, etc. These are 4 R principles about how to kickstart a U.S.-China relationship. And then we have Mr. Yang Jiechi, director of the Central Committee's Foreign Policy Office, right? And then you have President Xi Jinping, who made a phone call with President Biden on the eve of Chinese New Year. So the Chinese government indeed has been sending out all these positive messages. However, like you said, the response on the U.S. side has not been very positive, I have to say. One example is you look at the most recent Gallup poll, which was released about last week, which showed that there were only about 20% of Americans who had favorable views of China. This is a record low since 1979. Now, public opinion is one indicator, but oftentimes I would argue that public opinion is very much influenced by what political elites like presidents, secretary of states, and other politicians say about China. So in that sense, you could say it takes a long time for the current U.S.-China relationship to get back to normal. You use the word normal, right? I think it will take some time. The damage was done by the Donald Trump administration, and once the damage was done, it will take some time to recover from that damage. And so it does need statesmanship, it does need vision and courage in the capitals of both countries to deal with arguably the most important bilateral relationship in the world today.
Besides the U.S., we also pay a lot of attention to the relations between China and the EU. And last year, China and the EU signed the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment after 35 rounds of negotiations throughout 7 years. And on March the 1st, the EU-China Geographical Indications Agreement also took effect. But as we mentioned, the U.S. seems like an unavoidable factor in the relations between China and the EU. And Joe Biden also promised to renew and reinvigorate transatlantic ties to try to regain trust of the major allies in America. So how do you see the dynamics between the 3 major powers, China, the EU, and U.S., concerning all these factors?
Yeah, EU, China, United States, when you talk about EU and China, there's always this big looming factor in the background that is the United States of America, which has a defense treaty that is NATO with European countries. And also you have this shared cultural heritage with European countries. And so if you have the European Union signing a comprehensive agreement on the investment treaty with China, and this was just days before the new president was elected, right? And so this could be viewed as a kind of a big blow to not just the Donald Trump administration, but to the new administration. I remember a senior official from the outgoing Donald Trump administration said, quote, he was perplexed and stunned that the European Union would sign a new investment treaty just on the eve of a new administration. So obviously he was not prepared for such a quick conclusion of the agreement. Okay. Now, even with this agreement on the paper, however, I have to say we have to factor in this historical, cultural, and political ties between these countries across Atlantic. So I would say we should not celebrate this as a absolute victory for the Chinese government. Instead, I would say this is just one example that we can use this to show that the Chinese government is reaching out to many other countries, and China is willing to open its door to foreign investment. But looking ahead, I think many European politicians would try to use other issues to try to delay the ratification of the agreement or to cause some additional obstacle to the implementation of this agreement. One example is that they could use human rights, they could use environmental, like climate change and other issues. And so I think, let me say it again, it's probably too early to say that this is a golden era for China-EU relationship. I would say that this is more an act of the European Union asserting its own strategic autonomy, that we are no longer just following orders from Washington, D.C. Instead, we can also make our own decision.
Thank you, Professor Xie. Our reporter Jie Qiong, based at one CPPCC guest house, has chatted with some CPPCC members about their opinions and views on relevant issues in China's diplomacy. Let's hear from Jie Qiong and see what she wants to share with our audience. Hi, Jie Qiong.
Hello, Xiaomeng and Professor Xie. This is Jie Qiong. Right now, I'm still staying at the Beijing Railway Hotel, one of the venues that host CPPCC members. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke on China's foreign policy and external relations on Sunday. And actually, regardless of their fields of specialty, many CPPCC members have talked about this issue in their interviews that I have been assisting in. I think that is because it is a significant factor that can have impact on almost any industry. Well, I remember Foreign Minister Wang Yi said on the press conference that China and the European Unions share broad common interest and are not systemic rivals. In this regard, Song Xin, a CPPCC member, said in his interview that although China may have competition with other countries in many fields, there are still some fields suited for collaboration, such as the one he works in, which is energy conservation and environmental protection. In addition, the famous anchor from China Media Group, Bai Yansong, who's also a CPPCC member, shared about his understanding of the current international environment. And in his own words, the whole world is not yet prepared to deal with a rising China that is strong in many fields. But we ourselves need to be prepared, and everyone should be an advocate of the idea of a mankind with a shared future. That is to say, we need to be patient while prepared. I think I very much agree with his idea, and also I do believe that we are doing our part in the global community, and we will continue doing so. Well, these are my observations, and I'm looking forward to more professional discussion from the studio. Back to you, Xiaomeng.
Thank you, Jie Qiong. And Professor Xie, after 8 years of negotiations, as you just mentioned, China is opening up wider to more foreign investment, and China has signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, what we call RCEP. And Professor Xie, what do you think that RCEP will impact the integration of Asia-Pacific economy and the economic recovery from the pandemic?
RCEP, I would say, is another gesture of the Chinese government's willingness to deepen its economic reform and to continue to open its door to foreign trade and foreign investment. RCEP has a membership states that is 15, and altogether they account for about half of the world's population and 1/3 of the world's aggregate GDP. It also comprises countries like, in addition to the 10 countries from ASEAN, including China, Korea, and Australia. So that's the world's most dynamic region, the Asia Pacific, right? So I think this is I wouldn't say, because, if you say this is the future of the world, that's probably an over-exaggeration. But you say this is an important direction for the future international trade, I think that's fair. This is also a kind of a message to some countries around the world that China still can start and can lead initiatives in international trade, like this multilateral trade negotiations. And China, in fact, has its own attractive power to bring these countries onto the bandwagon of free trade and free investment.
And also, right now, we're also caring about China's COVID-19 vaccines because more than 60 countries are or will be having China-donated COVID-19 vaccines. And China has also promised to provide 10 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines to COVAX. But some Western countries doubt that China is launching an arms race in terms of by providing these vaccines. And this is actually a vaccine diplomacy to gain geopolitical influence. So how do you make of such voices and concerns, Professor Xie?
Well, if I were to respond this question to foreign journalists, I would say, yes, it is a race, but it's not an arms race. It's not a geopolitical race. Instead, it's a race of which country can best take care of its own people. Now, this is a race not to the bottom, but a race to the very top. Which country can mobilize its own people, mobilize its own medical technology, human resources, transportation facilities to develop vaccine and to take care of its own people. And on top of that, if you have the vaccine and you are willing to provide them free of charge to less developed countries to show that you care about the international community. So absolutely, this is a race. But I think China has done better than most other countries. I wouldn't say China has done better than any other country, but China has done very, very good in terms of developing its own vaccine and provide them to other countries. So I think the Chinese government should absolutely be applauded for mobilizing its own resources to develop this vaccine, one of the first countries to develop this and to apply this to its own population. And so look around China now. Many people are taking the vaccine.
Okay, back to the two sessions. Actually, one of the hot button issues is concerning Hong Kong's electoral system reform, and many are watching closely as to a draft decision concerning the electoral system reform during the two sessions. And patriots governing Hong Kong has become the essence of the Chinese central government's policy on Hong Kong. But some have doubted that this might endanger the one country, two systems policy. And Professor Xie, how would you respond to such voices, and what is your view as to such concerns?
One country, two systems, first is one country. Then you have two systems. Now, one country means one sovereignty, and which is undisputable, which is inviolable. And so in that sense, Chinese government has absolute authority to determine its own election rules, not just in here, but also in Hong Kong, right? Now, for patriots to govern Hong Kong, now if you are not a patriot of your own country, Why would people elect you to pass laws, to deliberate these important public policy issues? So I think this is uncontroversial in many other countries. Look at what happened in the United States on January 6th. Okay, so many of these mobs, they breached the Capitol Hill, and then they try to, change the election results, right? And these people are being prosecuted by the United States federal government, right? So these people, some of them are facing treason charges. And so if you are not a patriot, why would people vote for you to govern my own country? And besides, like I said, again, one country means one sovereignty, and the one sovereignty lies in Beijing. And so we absolutely have the authority to change the rules and to allow more reasoned, rational, balanced voices come into the Legislative Council and to bring real people's concerns to the legislators, and so that they can have meaningful input in the future of Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you, Professor Xie. And we also believe that Hong Kong's future will be brighter. And thank you for coming to the studio today. And that's all for today's two-session spotlight. And hope that you can join us with more live streaming events on the People's Daily English Language app. And bye.